Shalom and good morning all. We continue our Genesis to Revelations annual study as to what is needed for salvation. Today we are on Judges chapters 13 to 16, titled Samson and the Nazarite vow. First I'll read the scriptures and then I'll comment on the relevant verses. Starting from Judges chapter 13 verse 1. And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of Yahweh, and Yahweh delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and bare not. And the angel of Yahweh appeared unto the woman, and said unto her, Behold, now thou art barren, and bearest not, but thou shalt conceive, and bear a son. Verse 4. Now therefore beware, I pray thee, and drink not wine, nor strong drink, and eat not any unclean thing. For lo, thou shalt conceive, and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. My comment. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 says, And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. God put away the first group of people who committed evil by wiping them out and leaving only righteous Noah and family. Because of his vow in Genesis chapters 9-11, that's God's vow, he restricted his options, saying he would not do that again. One option was to put a difference between a group of people representing him and others. Israel and other nations, which the Bible calls them Gentiles. Now, Gentiles does not mean necessarily the nation. Anyway, the word Gentile can be used twice in two respects. Anyone living in those foreign, it actually means nations. So anyone living in those foreign nations would be a Gentile. Whether you are a Jew or a natural Gentile of that land, you are living in that foreign nation, a Gentile nation. So sadly, that group, Israel, are human like the other nations and also keep committing evil. We just read that in verse 13, verse 1. His salvation, which is to rescue people, always, or at least thus far, has come from within their group to save their nation. This is God's saving Israel by raising up prophets. Here it is of the tribe of Dan, from where he be raising up the prophet. Remember this precept. It will be relevant in understanding the New Testament as to who goes to save Israel. Messiah's words and purpose, when he says, for example, but he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost tribe of Israel. So like God raises up prophets out of Israel, he raises up Messiah like he promised to Moses. And Paul's ministry, again, Paul and Barnabas were people from that Israelites sent to Israelites to save them or bring salvation to them. As with Abraham, we may also see the pattern of barren women, undefiled, being mothers of deliverers of prophets, as Samuel and John the Baptist. We saw the Nazarite vow in Numbers chapter 6, verse 2. This book is called Judges, yet no one so far is following the rule for a judge, which we read in Kings. For being a judge or a king, we read this in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 11 to 18. If I remember rightly, that they should make a copy of this book and rule from it. So moving on back to the actual text of the Bible, Judges chapter 13, verse 7. But he said unto me, Behold, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and now drink no wine, nor strong drink, neither eat any unclean thing, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Then Manoah entreated Yahweh and said, O my Lord, let the man of God which thou didst send come again unto us, and teach us what we shall do unto the child that he shall be born. Verse 9. And God hearkened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again unto the woman as she sat in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. My comment again. Verse 14, although the child was to be under the Nazarite vow, the mother also had to abide by the food diet. Consider why. Just we hear today, people who are drug addicts, their children could get that habit because they get the drugs through the feeding of the mother. The mother's system goes in there. So that's why the mother in this case always had to be clear of those substances so that it doesn't go into the child. Verse 20. For it came to pass when the flame went up towards heaven from off the altar that the angel of Yahweh ascended in the flame of the altar. And this is an offering. And Manoah and his wife looked on it and fell on their faces to the ground. Verse 24. And the woman bare a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and Yahweh blessed him. And the spirit of Yahweh began to move him at times in the camp of Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. My comment again. In verse 20, reminds me of the many times we are told correct and correctly performed sacrifices are pleasing to God. We cannot offer God what we want when we want. Genesis 8 verse 20 says, And Noah builded an altar unto Yahweh, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Verse 21. And Yahweh smelt a sweet savour. Jeremiah 17:26. And they shall come from the cities of Judah, and from the places about Jerusalem, and from the land of Benjamin, and from the plain, and from the mountains, and from the south, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, and meat offerings, and incense, and bring in sacrifices of praise unto the house of Yahweh. So notice this sacrifice of praise, even when we do not have animal to offer, or there is no temple to do the sacrifice of priests, we offer sacrifices of praise. We read this again in the book of Hebrews and other places. Okay, chapter 40 verse 1. Before I go on to that, so I was told last week by a lady who says she does not see how we can continue the sacrificial system, because she, like most people, think the sacrificial system necessitates an animal. And no, the sacrificial system necessitates a temple, a priest or high priest, and a sacrifice. We are the temple of God, as we told in the New Testament. We do have a high priest in Yeshua the Messiah, and our sacrifices, as we just read, are of praises. So, Judges chapter 14 verse 1. And Samson went down to Timnath, and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistine. And he came up and told his father and his mother, and said, I have seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all thy people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleaseth me. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of Yahweh, that he sought an occasion or reason against the Philistines, for at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So all things works for good. Right, as the same with Joseph, we have Joseph sold by his brothers, and it turned out to be for the purpose. So my comment, as in this event we shall see God working through humans to bring his earthly events to fulfillment. And fulfill does not mean to change, as people think it does when Yeshua comes and says, I haven't come to change the law, but to fulfill it. Remember Joseph being thrown into the pit and sold into Egypt? Well, we shall also see a similar with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, Nehemiah and King Artaxerxes, poor and lost tribe of Israel. In other words, all of these things are relevant for God to work through humans to bring about what he desires for his chosen tribe Israel. Same as when Judges, Joshua blew the trumpets and the temple and the walls of Jericho fell down. My comment, up to verse 9, Judges 14:9. And he took thereof in his hands and went on eating. Oh, again, you're supposed to read this whole chapters. I'm just identifying some verses to bring out some points. So Samson kills a lion and he's eating the honey. The bees make some honey and he's eating the honey. And he took thereof in his hands and he went on eating and came to his father and mother and he gave them and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion, a dead lion. So his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made their feast, for so used the young men to do. Now we are not told if the parents told Samson he was to follow the Nazarite vow. We can assume they did, as they asked the angel how to teach their son. Samson also knew his strength came from his hair. The eating of the honey from a dead lion was against the unclean vow. The feast may have been in celebration of taking the woman of verse 8, i.e. getting a wife, the celebration. There was no ceremony, just like we saw in Exodus when Laman took his two daughters and gave to Jacob, or his first daughter. We see he got all the men together and they had a feast, and then he gave his daughter to Jacob. There's no priest or church ceremony as is practiced today. Now going back onto continue. The feast may have been done that one. Judges 14 verse 10. So his father went down onto the woman, and Samson made their feast, for so used the men so to do. Again, this is Genesis chapters 29 verse 22, which says, and Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. If you want the reference to what I just said. Judges 14:15. And it came to pass on the seventh day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice thy husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee and thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that we have? Is it not so? And Samson's wife wept before him and said, thou dost but hate me and lovest me not. Thou hast put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and hast not told me. And he said unto her, behold, I have not told it my father nor my mother, and shall I tell it to thee? Verse 7. And she wept before him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him. And she told the riddle to the children of her people, being the Philistines. Verse 19. And the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and slew 30 men of them, and took their spoil, and gave change of garments unto them, which expounded the riddle. Expound means explain the riddle. And his anger was kindled, and he went up to his father's house. Verse 20. But Samson's wife was given to his companion, whom he had used as his friends. So again, if you follow the story, Samson went to Delilah, I think is her name, fell in love with her. He had exceptional strength. The Philistine men mocked him, and he basically gave him a riddle. That if they can solve the riddle, that he would give them 7 new garments. And I think the riddle was, out of the dead comes something sweet, or something of that nature, meaning the honey. and they couldn't work it out, so they got Delilah to moan and persuade him to tell her. So he did tell it to her, and they told it to him. And he then, therefore, in his wrath, went and killed 30 of the Philistines, took their clothing, and paid off his debt. Now, I am in thoughts about this, whether this honey was a breach of the vow. If you look at the vows of clean and unclean animals, an animal that dies of its own or dies of a disease is unclean. An animal that is killed is not unclean. So we are not told how this animal died. You're just told it's a carcass. So whether Samson killed it or whether it died naturally or so, or we don't know. And then we have the honey coming from the lion. Anyway, my point is you can contemplate whether he actually broke the vow by eating honey from the dead animal, the dead lion. Moving on to Judges chapters 15, verse 1. But it came to pass within a while after, in the time of wheat harvest, that Samson visited his wife with a kid. And he said, I will go in to my wife into the chamber. But her father would not suffer him to go in. And her father said, I verily thought that thou hadst utterly hated her. Therefore I gave her to thy companion. Is not her younger sister fairer than she? Take her, I pray thee, instead of her. Verse 3. And Samson said concerning them, Now shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure. Jumping to verse 20. And he judged Israel in the days of Philistines 20 years. So here we have Samson being the first judge of Israel. It doesn't say how he judged, it just says he judged. Judges chapter 16 verse 1. Then went Samson to Gaza and saw there an harlot and went in unto her. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither, or come here. And they compassed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all night, saying, In the morning when it is day, we shall kill him. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city of the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of an hill that is before Hebron. And it came to pass afterwards that he loved a woman in the valley of Shorek, whose name was Delilah. So that was not Delilah the first time. Verse 5. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that he may bind him to afflict him. And we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. Verse 6. And Delilah said to Samson, Tell me, I pray thee, wherein thy great strength lieth, and wherein thou mightest be bound to afflict thee. Verse 15. 16:15. And she said unto him, How canst thou say, I love thee, when thy heart is not with me? Thou hast mocked me these 3 times, and hast not told me wherein thy great strength lieth. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, and urged him so that his soul was vexed unto death, that he told her all his heart, and said unto her, There hath not come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak, and be like any other man. Verse 8. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, Come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought her money in their hand. And this is why I want you to read the whole chapters, in case I make a mistake, as I just did above, saying the first occasion was for Delilah, and it wasn't. This is the second occasion when he told about his hair. I'm just really identifying verses that has some relevance to salvation. Judges chapter 16 verse 20. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before and shake myself. He wished not, or he did not know, that Yahweh was departed from him, because they've cut his hair. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass. And he did grind the prison house, meaning the corn, turn the wheels to grind the corn around over the wheat. Verse 22, 16:22. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow. That's how long he was there. Again, after he was shaven. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice to Dragon. Dragon is the fish god, which is where eating fish on Fridays come from. And to rejoice, for they said, our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. 28, verse 28. And Samson called unto Yahweh and said, O Yahweh my God, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me. I pray thee only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenger of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars upon which the house stood, and on which it was held up, of the one with his right hand, and of the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might, and the house fell upon the lords, and upon all the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew at his death were more than they which he slew in his life. Verse 31. Then his brethren and all the house of his father came down, and took him, and brought him up, and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel 20 years. So remember, this was so God could take action against the pagan gods and their worshippers, as he did with Pharaoh in Egypt. When Israel goes after pagan gods, God chastises them to return to the right way. When pagans do the same, he destroys them. The lords of the Philistines also call their gods lords, which is why we should not call God Lord, as they changed it in the Bible. God, the name Yahweh was taken out and substituted for lords. Shalom until tomorrow when we continue our studies.